Assalamu alaikum, good evening. We have quite a few books to introduce, new books that is, to Wardah books. So the first one is The Leadership of Prophet Muhammadﷺ, a historical reconstruction by Joel Hayward. This is a book that explores thematically leadership and is based on the seerah of the Prophet ﷺ. The author himself is a military expert. Joel Hayward is a military expert, and he has worked in the Middle East as well as in the UK, and he has led several military institutions. So his perspective is quite intriguing. However, saying that not all his views are military views, because he talks about the Prophet in different aspects, about his authority, about his human touch, and it's about his ability to connect people, which is so important to leadership. So this is the first book. The next book is Servant of the Loving One by Paul Abdul Wadud Sutherland. It is about the author's encounter with a Sheikh Nazim, who just passed on. Sheikh Nazim is the Sheikh of the Naqshbandi order. So Paul Abdul Wadud Sutherland had converted to Islam and was initiated to the Naqshbandi Tariqah, and he was associated with Sheikh Nazim. So this book describes some of these encounters and has some poetry about Sheikh Nazim, or inspired by his encounter with Sheikh Nazim. Paul Abdul Wadud Sutherland, his name would be familiar to those of us who listen to the talks of Abdul Hakim Murad, because Abdul Hakim Murad quotes from his poetry quite liberally, and inshallah we will have more works by Paul Abdul Wadud Sutherland on his other poetry anthologies in the weeks to come, inshallah. The Flying Man, this is a book that just published. Is by Akbar Ahmed. He wrote this in lockdown. This book, the title is The Flying Man, and it alludes to the thought experiment by Ibn Sina. The thought experiment goes something like this: if a man is suspended in mid-air and none of his senses is in contact with anything, he cannot see, he cannot hear, will he still be able to be aware of himself? So that's how he sets up the thought experiment. It's very much like how Plato talked about the cave, the allegory of the cave. But anyway, this book not only talks about Ibn Sina, it talks about all the major philosophers in Islam, as well as the contributions these philosophers have made, not only to Islam but to the Judeo-Christian world and into the modern world. So he talks about this in a very accessible small volume. And Prof. Akbar Ahmed has written many books, as I said before, written books with the Brookings Institute, with the BBC, and he is currently the Ibn Khaldun Chair at the American University. So this is his latest book. The next book is this book by Roger Scruton, who just passed away at the end of last year. This book is How to Be a Conservative. Now there's a bit of a story to this book, and the reason why we are stocking the books by Roger Scruton. Several years ago, Sheikh Hamza Yusuf came to the store, and we had a discussion for about an hour about books, and he pointed out that we had a gap in the collection of books in our philosophy section, and this was in the conservative philosophers. So at that time I was still a bit naive, and I thought that conservatism was only, because my understanding of conservatism was limited to political conservatism exemplified by the American Republican Party. So there was a very skewed understanding of conservatism. But with further reading, I realized that at the simplest level, conservatism is the recognition that generations past have bequeathed us with an awesome heritage, that of language, or institutions, or culture, or art, our religion. It has been bequeathed to us by generations that have worked to preserve something to bequeath to later generations, i.e. us. So with that recognition, we need to preserve, and we need to also bequeath this to our generations ahead. So Roger Scruton's work talks about that, both the metaphysical part of conservatism and the more practical parts. So this is perhaps an accessible work for Scruton. The rise of science and Islam and the West. The scope of this work is quite huge. It traces the development of science from the Greeks to the Byzantines and to the rise of the Muslims. And it also talks about, not only does it talk about the translation movement that the Muslims initiated, but it also talks about original scientific discoveries by Muslims. Like for example, the discovery, or rather the postulation, that there existed the pulmonary circulatory system in the human body. The Muslims postulated that this had to exist. It was only centuries later that someone like William Harvey in England discovered it through dissection, that there was actually a separate circulation happening with the lungs and the heart. So things like that, this book draws out. So these original discoveries among Muslims in medicine, in mathematics, and in astronomy, just to pick a few. Then he talks about how science was viewed in a deeply religious society such as that of Islam, and how science continued to play a major role in Islam right up to the 1600s, during which time there was a decline. That's another discussion, but he does talk about this in this book. Okay, God, Life and the Cosmos, Christian and Islamic Perspectives. This is a multi-author work curated very well by these editors. This book discusses the role of religion, or in this case the Abrahamic religion, and science. And it talks about some of the hot button issues. Firstly, it talks about philosophy and science, such as hermeneutics and ethics, and the rise of secularism. The second issue it talks about is cosmology. So it talks about how science has changed paradigms in society, and also more importantly, how it has influenced our ideas of causality. So definitely there's a discussion about Darwin, for example. And the third is the issue of bioethics. So this is God, Life and the Cosmos. Alasdair, MacIntyre's After Virtue. We've had this book before in Wardah. This is a reissue by Bloomsbury in the Revelation series. So this book was published in 1981, and it is one of those landmark books on modern morality and modern virtue. And this is important. While this book is primarily Aristotelian, it is important for people to recover the language of morality. A lot of what we discuss nowadays is limited to either two poles, that of the state and politics, or that of the market and economy. So we need to recover the third discussion on morality, the right and the wrong, and things about beauty and virtue. So Alasdair MacIntyre's book is a classic in this regard. The last book for this week that is new is again in the Revelation series by Bloomsbury, is Gadamer's book on Truth and Method. This is a book on hermeneutics and the different kinds of hermeneutics of skepticism and the hermeneutics of truth, how we have changed the way we interpret text and interpret things that happen. So that's it for today.